For those people that are hiding action figures in the cereal aisles at Target, please stop, okay? I am there shopping for my Apple Jacks and Fruit Loops because that's what grown-ass men eat for breakfast. And I happen to find those really hard, difficult to obtain action figures in there, and it's just not cool. Stop it, okay? There's literally people losing their hair and minds over these figures, and you guys are just playing games with them. Anyways, but all jokes aside, today's video is actually incredibly serious, or I guess as serious as you can get in an action figure collecting channel. So basically, I wanted to talk a little bit about something that I ran into recently. It got pretty intense, up to the point where I actually thought that McFarlane was going to take his big giant wrapper chain and choke Shartimus Prime out with it. Well, I kid. I mean, I kind of kid, but it's kind of serious. Anyways, I wanted to talk a little bit about that, and I'll preface that by saying that I did a similar video where I kind of overanalyzed something that happened with Pixel Dan and McFarlane I think it was a few months ago, where he went into an interview and McFarlane got incredibly confrontational with him because he essentially brought up the digital Build-A-Figures that McFarlane was releasing. And I'm not going to get too deep into it because I already kind of dissected it in the previous video, but essentially he got offended just because Pixel Dan kind of said it in a sarcastic way, and McFarlane just wasn't having it, and he got offended over it. But by the way, I 100% agree with Pixel Dan in that argument, because there were a lot of people on the community that were complaining about it, and so for him to bring it up to McFarlane, I think he was just kind of like a middleman for the community, and it just made no sense to me for McFarlane to get that offensive over it. Not only that, he just didn't have any valid points. He was arguing that people that had 400-foot square apartments didn't have any room to display, so they would go and collect Build-A-Figures digitally. It made no sense to me, at least in my personal opinion. And so something similar happened with this Shartimus incident. Now look, I'll give you guys again a little bit more of background. I'm not really a big Shartimus Prime fan. I do dabble here and there. I've watched a few of his reviews from time to time. He's not really my cup of tea, but like I said, I do watch his stuff. Now this video is like 4 to 5 years old. This is when McFarlane had originally first received the DC Multiverse line. He was receiving a bunch of other properties that he was getting to make figures out of, and so it was just really interesting to see him. Now, essentially what happens here is, I'm not going to play the entire clip or any part of the clip because I don't want to get in trouble with Shartimus Prime, but essentially there was a brief little moment or a few minutes in that interview that things got very intense, very heated, and McFarlane kind of like hijacked the entire interview. Now, like I said, I'm not a fan of Shartimus, but I definitely have to commend him for his attitude and his fearlessness. Even though there was a moment, just like Pixel Dan, that they kind of like backed off because they realized like, hey, these guys send us free stuff, and so it would be foolish to bite that hand that feeds. So for the most part, they kind of like toned it back a little bit, and they let McFarlane kind of take over the interview. But there was a moment in there where Shartimus was actually pretty brave and brought up the fact that a lot of people were complaining about the scale. They wanted something closer to Mattel or the 1/12 scale, whereas in McFarlane had his own scale. And all of the bigger OMs, and he does have a very valid point. And by the way, again, he was bringing up stuff, Shartimus was bringing up stuff that the community was complaining about. Like, he was a middleman, he was bringing it to the forefront, even if he didn't necessarily agree with it. And McFarlane just, again, didn't handle the situation incredibly well. I've already said previously that I think he should hire somebody to handle all of these promotional events. I just don't see him as, he's the face of the company, but I just don't see him handling those kind of like interrogation scenes very well. And ultimately he comes off as kind of like a bit of a hard ass, and it turns off a lot of people from the community from picking up a lot of his collectibles. So in this particular instant, like I said, Shartimus was just voicing the opinion of the community, saying, hey, why isn't McFarlane sticking to the 1/12 scale that Mattel had been playing around with? Mezco does a lot of it, and so on and so forth. Whereas in, like I said, a lot of the bigger OMs like Marvel Legends, you have the G.I. Joe stuff, a lot of those figures are closer to the 1/12 scale, so it would make much more sense for him to stay at the 1/12 rather than go the route of the 7-inch or the 1/10 scale, which is closer to like NECA and all of those other OMs. There are a few other lines, for example, the Super 7 line as well, that dabbles with like that 1/10 scale or 7-inch line. And a lot of people just didn't feel that that was the proper scaling to go with. A lot of people felt that they should have stayed or reverted back to like the 112 scale, which at the time Mattel had the license for a few years. But I think it's worth reiterating, it's just the way that he handled. He could have easily just kind of played it off or said, hey, we're going to try to do our own thing. We're not going to try to do what the previous company or the previous OM was doing, because maybe that wasn't working. And essentially that's what he said, but he said it in just a very arrogant way. So essentially saying, hey, I've been doing this for 25 years. Shartimus, you have no idea what you're talking about. Just keep your giant trap hole shut. And I just don't feel that that's the proper way that he should have handled that. He did it in just a very unprofessional manner. And honestly, I feel like maybe he did turn off a lot of customers from just the way that he handled that, just his attitude towards Shartimus. Like I said, I'm not necessarily the biggest fan, but I feel like I do have to come out and defend him a little bit. I know it's a completely older video. Like I said, I'm not going to play any clips of it because I don't know Shartimus personally, and I don't want him to get upset, or I don't want to fall into any copyright situations where he might get angry because I posted one of his clips or I'm stealing views from him. But I'll post some like screenshots, and I'll post a link in the description to the full video that you guys can actually check it out. But essentially, yeah, that's how it happened. That's how it transpired. And it was just a really interesting situation because, as I said, both Pixel Dan and Shartimus have only brought up complaints that the community are throwing to the forefront. It's not like their own personal opinion. This isn't something that they're manufacturing for views. It definitely doesn't affect them one bit because they're already some of the biggest content creators and they have a great platform. So at least in my personal opinion, I think that this could have been played differently from McFarlane's side of things. I think in both cases, both content creators had very good, valid points. Specifically more in Pixel Dan's point of view, because the scaling thing, I don't mind McFarlane having his own scale. I don't necessarily feel like I need to mix in my Marvel Legends with my DC Multiverse display, but both are very valid points. And if McFarlane is going to get incredibly defensive and incredibly arrogant anytime somebody brings something up to him about his line, I think it's like I said, it's a bad look for him. It's bad publicity. And eventually I do feel like this is going to start to kind of poke at his company a little bit here and there. Maybe not tear down the entire structure of it, but it definitely will hurt because he's just not handling those public appearances the way that he needs to. If he's going to confront somebody or if he's going to respond to somebody, he has to do it professionally without getting completely defensive. There's actually a moment in that Shartimus Prime where he kind of like, I don't even know if he physically touched him, but it almost feels like he shoved Shartimus Prime out from like the center of the camera and was like, hey, let me rant, let me just say exactly what it is that I need to say because I'm always right about everything. And he goes to like the center of the camera and Shartimus is just kind of like in a really awkward position, kind of very similar to what happened with Pixel Dan. Like they don't necessarily know exactly what to do. In both cases, both of these personalities are very down to earth. They're very humble content creators, and so I don't necessarily see them as like confrontational people that are going to get in the face of McFarlane and be like, hey, personal bubble, especially in Pixel Dan's case where he was, McFarlane had his hand on his shoulder the entire time and was kind of like trying to intimidate him through stretches. But look, I may be looking too deep into this. Like I said, this was like 4 to 5 years ago, right when McFarlane had acquired all of these licenses. So I could be completely wrong. And since then, McFarlane has been incredibly successful. But I just wanted to bring it up because I actually do remember kind of watching this video maybe when it first came out, but I didn't really pay too much attention to it. And now the second time around, it got recommended to me and I watched it and kind of like analyzed it in my head and felt like I needed to make a video about it because even though I am a huge McFarlane fan, there are situations that I think he could handle better, and this is just a prime example of that. But as always, I may just be causing drama for absolutely no reason. Let me know down below in the comment section, do I have a valid point or do I not? Very curious to see what you guys have to say. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. As always, if you guys enjoy the content, definitely stay tuned because we do upload stuff like this pretty consistently. Stay safe out there, enjoy the hobby, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you.